Almost to the day a year ago, we read in our book club, which we also have a book club, a book called Age of Vice. The book had been recommended by our good friend Milan Vaishnav, who has a podcast on Indian politics, and if that's a topic that you're interested in, you should totally go and subscribe to it. It's called Grand Tamasha, and it's excellent. And he wrote a review of Age of Vice, written by Deepti Kapoor, and he wrote, on first glance, it is a modern take on a classic gangster story, but at heart, it is a sprawling tale of power, greed, love, and capitalism run amok. And ever since Deepti Kapoor, the author of the book, started as a guest on Milan's podcast, we know from that conversation that Deepti, in her research for the book, had used Milan's book, which is called When Crime Pays, Money and Muscle in Indian Politics, to research her novel. And another book she had used was The Billionaire Rush by James Crabtree. James, of course, is currently our Toy Senior Fellow on Geopolitics in Asia, and through a combination of luck, coincidence, but also planning, he is here tonight to moderate the conversation with Deepti Kapoor and sort of close the circle. The two of them share a history in journalism, and both have reported on India in that capacity. They have missed each other kind of in timing. Deepti started out her career in the early 2000s in New Delhi, before then turning towards fiction. James served as the Mumbai bureau chief for the Financial Times until 2016, before heading onwards to Singapore, and then returning a few months ago to his home in London. For tonight, we will first hear Deepti read a short section from the book, the very beginning, just sort of get you, if you've read the book, sort of to get you back into the scene, and if you have not read the book yet, sort of give you a little bit of a sense and hopefully whet your appetite for reading the entire thing. And then James will join her for the conversation on stage, and of course.
New Delhi, 2004. 5 pavement dwellers lie dead at the side of Delhi's inner ring road. It sounds like the start of a sick joke. If it is, no one told them. They die where they slept. Almost. Their bodies have been dragged 10 meters by the speeding Mercedes that jumped the curb and cut them down. It's February, 3 a.m., 6 degrees. 15 million souls curl up in sleep. A pale fog of sulfur lines the streets. And one of the dead, Ragini, was 18 years old. She was 5 months pregnant at the time. Her husband, Rajesh, 23, was sleeping by her side, both belly up, tucked in with heavy shawls at the crown and feet, looking like corpses anyway, save the telltale signs. The rucksack beneath the head, the sandals lined up neatly beside the arms. A cruel twist of fate. This couple arrived in Delhi only yesterday, taking refuge with Krishna, Yad, and Chotu, 3 migrant laborers from the same district in Uttar Pradesh. Each day, these men woke before dawn to trek to the labor mandi at Company Bagh, trying to grab whatever daily wage they could find. Dhaba cook, wedding waiter, construction laborer, sending money back to their village, paying for a sister's shadi, a brother's schooling, a father's nightly medicine. Living day to day, hour to hour, the working poor, struggling to survive. Returning to sleep in this barren spot after dark, beside the ring road, close to Nigambodh Ghat, close to the demolished slums of the Yamuna Pushta that had been their home. But the newspapers don't dwell on these 3 men. Their names vanish at dawn with the stars. A police van with 4 cops inside arrives at the crash site. They climb out and see the dead bodies and the wailing, angry crowd that now surrounds the car. There's someone still inside. A young man sitting bolt upright, arms braced at the wheel, eyes shut tightly. Is he dead? Did he die like that? The cops push the rabble aside and peer in. Is he sleeping? One cop says to his colleagues. These words cause the driver to turn his head and, like some monster, open his eyes. The cop looks back and almost jumps in fright. There's something grotesque about the driver's smooth, handsome face. His eyes are leering and wild, but other than that, there's not a hair out of place. The cops pull open the door, wave their lathis thunderously, order him out. There's an empty bottle of Black Label at his feet. He's a lean man, gym-honed, wearing a grey gabardine safari suit, hair parted, millimeter fine, impeccably oiled. Beneath the reek of whiskey, there's another scent, Davidoff cool water. Not that these cops know. What they know is this: he's not a rich man at all, rather a facsimile, a man dressed in the imitation of wealth, in its service. The clothes, the well-groomed features, the car, they cannot hide the essential poverty of his birth. Its smell is stronger than any liquor or cologne. Yes, he's a servant, a chauffeur, a driver, a boy. A well-fed and housebroken version of what lies dead on the road. And this is not his Mercedes, which means he can be hurt. He sobs in oblivion as the cops drag him out. Bent double, he vomits on his own loafers. One cop hits him here with his lathi, hauls him up. Another searches his body, finds his wallet, finds an empty shoulder holster, finds a matchbook from a hotel called the Palace Grand, finds a money clip holding 20,000 rupees. Whose car is this? Where did the money come from? Who did you steal it from? Thought you'd go for a joyride? Whose liquor is it? Chutia, where's the gun? Fucker, who do you work for? In his wallet, there's an election card, a driver's license, 300 rupees. His cards say he is Ajay. His father's name is Hari. He was born January 1st, 1982. And the Mercedes? It is registered to one Gautam Rathore. The cops confer. The name sounds familiar. And the address, Aurangzeb Road, speaks for itself. Only the rich and powerful live there. Chutia, an officer barks, holding up the car's papers. Is this your boss? But this young man called Ajay is too drunk to speak. Asshole, did you take his car? One of the cops walks to the side and looks down at the dead. The girl's eyes are open, skin already blue in the cold. She's bleeding from the space between her legs where life has been. In the station, Ajay is stripped and left naked in a cold and windowless room. He's so drunk, he passes out. The constables return to throw icy water over him, and he wakes with a scream. He is seated, and they press his shoulders against the wall, pull his legs apart. A female constable stands on his thighs until his circulation goes, and he roars in pain and passes out once more. By the next day, the case has gained traction. The media is appalled. At first, it's about the pregnant girl. News channels mourn her. But she was neither photogenic nor full of promise, so the focus shifts to the killer. A source confirms the car is a Mercedes registered to Gautam Rathore, and this is news. He's a fixture of the Delhi social scene, a polo player, a raconteur, and a prince, genuine royalty, the first and only son of a member of parliament, Maharaja Prasad Singh Rathore. Was Gautam Rathore driving? That's the question on everyone's lips. But no, his alibi is watertight. He was holidaying away from Delhi last night. He was at a Fort Palace hotel near Jaipur. His current location, unknown. But he has released a statement expressing his horror, sending his condolences to the deceased and their kin. The driver, his statement reveals, only recently began working for him. He seems to have taken the Mercedes without Gautam's knowledge, taken whiskey in the Mercedes and gone for an illicit spin. A statement from the police confirms as much. Ajay, employee of Gautam Rathore, stole a bottle of whiskey from Rathore's home while his employer was away, took the Mercedes for a joyride, lost control. This story becomes fact. It settles in the papers, and the FIR is registered. Ajay, son of Hari, is booked under Section 304A of the Indian Penal Code. Death due to negligence, maximum sentence, 2 years.
Good evening. Gosh, the lights are bright. We can't see you up here, so you can do anything you like, and we won't be able to see you. My name is James Crabtree. I'm the author of The Billionaire Raj, and it's my pleasure to chair this discussion this evening. So this is a really fantastic book. When you get asked to chair one of these things, then you always have a little bit of trepidation. You think, well, gosh, if I read this book and I don't like it very much, then I'm going to have to share this, and you have to sort of slightly pretend. But the book is a fantastic mixture of a sort of literary thriller, a real page turner, and a great pleasure to read from beginning to end, given it transported me back to the time that I lived in India and was researching my own book. And I suppose, so let's start right where you did the reading. One of the funny similarities between our two books is they both start with a car crash, although Deepti's is rather better written than mine. But why did you decide to begin the novel this way? Sort of why begin with that particular incident?
Well, this is a funny story. I did, when you're writing a novel, and it takes a while to sort of get to the place where you have the start, at least for me. And then when you have the start, then everything kind of flows. And sometimes it takes months to get there. And I was initially I wanted to write a novel about sort of these incredibly rich people in North India that I knew, and I wanted it to be kind of this Gatsby-style novel of these rich people who kind of do a lot of damage to the people around them, but then they always get to retreat behind their power and their wealth. And I was trying to come up with this start, which brought in this world, but also kind of brought in the consequences of their recklessness. And if you've ever been to India or even glanced at, say, Indian newspapers and the headlines, you'll always see that inevitably there are these brutal car crashes that happen quite regularly, where you'll have this normally extremely drunken man in a luxury car, often a Mercedes or a Porsche or whatever, and he's driving. It's always very late at night, and driving very high speed, and then crashes somewhere. And because, of course, it's India, you always have people sleeping on the pavement. So it's not just a car crash where the car gets totaled. It's mostly a scenario where people die, and then somehow, by some cruel twist of fate or whatever, the actual perpetrator of this crash disappears and is replaced by a driver or a servant. Someone else takes the blame, and that's when you have the confluence of everything in India. You have the corruption, the power, the complicity, the way the rich and the powerful in India get away with everything, including murder. And that's why I knew that it's like you have it when I remember writing this and thinking, okay, now I have it. Now I can really get into the novel.
And did that, in a sense, that came later in the process? You were writing bits of the rest of the novel, and the beginning came halfway through, or? No,
it came, but it came after a while. Like I knew I had written other chapters or versions, and I don't even remember, but I kept kind of struggling to get there, and when I got these pages, then it started to flow. And what about you? Because you also start with a crash. I remember reading it and thinking, okay. Yeah.
Much more cynical. I was just looking for something with a bit of drama, a kind of punch to begin, and people like car crashes. It's sort of there's a certain excitement to it, I suppose. So take just sort of, most of the people here, I suspect, have not yet read the book, although we'll buy it this evening and devour it very quickly. So they may not know the sort of story of how you came to write it. So I'd like to talk about the book is based around 3 characters, and in a sense, I'd like to talk about each of them in turn and what you were trying to do with them. But just tell people, how did you come to write it? As in, you used to be a journalist, you were living in Delhi, then you weren't living in Delhi. Sort of what was the story of how the book came to be?
Well, I lived in Delhi, and I worked as a journalist in the the early years of the millennium, the 2000s, and that was really a time when I remember India used to be a socialist state until, say, the mid-90s, and then we sort of changed the model, economic model, and so the time when I first went to university and also started to work as a journalist was when all the reforms started to impact in Delhi. Like Delhi used to be this very staid, boring city, and suddenly capitalism came and kind of gate crashed, and the party, and for a young woman who worked as a journalist driving around, it was almost like witnessing the birth of the city, the transformation from this, what I felt at the time was quite moribund, into something extremely exciting. There was an explosion of opportunity, of like art and culture, of just things started to happen. It felt like an exciting place to be. It almost felt like it had a world-class future. Now, of course, I realize that all of those hopes and dreams that me as a young privileged woman in Delhi had were built on a foundation of inequality and sort of structural violence and poverty. But at the time, try telling that to, say, young college girls who are dancing on tabletops in the first like bar in Delhi and drinking vodka shots at 2 a.m. It was just like, this was it. We had I don't know, it just felt like this was this world-class future. And coming to I worked as a journalist, and then I left and moved to Goa and became a yoga teacher, and then started to write novels. But I basically always went back to Delhi. Delhi is always this character in my novels. And the Age of Vice was my second novel. I was wondering about what to write. My first novel was well received critically, didn't sell many copies. Literary fiction is always one of those strange things. But anyway, I remember my agent at the time said to me, why don't you write, you're always telling me these crazy stories about all your rich friends, why don't you write a novel based on this? And then I thought, okay, and then, as I talked about how this Age of Vice was, I mean, it's a novel about power, about corruption, about complicity, about abuse of power, about but it's also kind of couched in this, in a sort of crime thriller. It's like the scaffolding is a crime thriller, and then it attacks these themes inside it. But it's also a novel based on the lives of people that I knew, that I grew up with. So it was almost, the way I write is it's always based on impressions of people or people, situations and events in my life, and then and then the themes come later. So I started to write a novel about the sort of Sunny character and the damage he does, and then later on, the character of Ajay came in, and then it really turned into something deeper.
So let's talk about the characters. We'll get on to Sunny in a minute, because he was the character I was most interested in. But the book starts, as you will have heard, with Ajay, who is as I think you will have guessed, the driver who didn't actually crash the car but took the rap. And he isn't a tycoon. He doesn't come from a kind of privileged background. So maybe you can sort of explain who he is and why, in a sense, you chose him as the entry point to the book, as opposed to one of these kind of Gatsby characters, of whom there are many that populate the rest of the novel. But in a sense, you didn't start there. You started in a different place. So why was that?
Well, why did I start?
Maybe start by explaining sort of Ajay's background and who he is.
Ajay is this, when we meet him, of course, he's the driver and the chauffeur of a rich man. And then basically we jump back in time to see Ajay is a young Dalit boy who gets sold, whose father is sort of killed. And then I'm not going to give anything much, but he gets sold into kind of benign slavery, working for a young couple in the mountains in the Himalayas, and through a series of adventures and events, finds himself in Delhi in his early 20s, working as for the young son and only heir to Sunny Wadia, who is the young heir to and son of Banti Vadia, who is this sort of he's a gangster businessman who operates in North India and has his hand in many pies. He controls the liquor trade, mining, construction mafia, sand mafia. So basically, I think Ajay was based, he was a kind of a composite of some characters or some people I had met when I worked as a journalist. I used to work as a journalist in the day, but I used to, party with these incredibly wealthy people at night. And I remember at that point of time, there were always these young men on the side of the room who were quiet and silent, and they would be serving you. And their job was to make sure that you were never out of a drink. All your needs were met even before you knew what your needs were. And I would always wonder, what are you thinking about this going on in front of you? What's going on? Where do you come from? What's happening in your head, in your mind? And years later, when I sort of quit that life and I was traveling in the mountains, I met a young boy who worked in a guest house, who told me his story of being sent away by his family to work for this young couple. And I just kind of, fused these stories together and created the character of Ajay.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it has in a sense, it gives the novel that sort of Bildungsroman quality of kind of going from the bottom to the top of the social hierarchy, as it were. But so let's talk about Sunny Wadia, who is the son of the tycoon. And I enjoyed this character immensely because it's almost a sort of an archetype of Indian life, that whether it's politicians or business leaders, you have the kind of the godfather figure, whether they're a political leader or a tycoon, and then you have their relationship to their children, which is, psychologically extremely complicated, as in the coming generation often reacts against the patriarch, but then in a sense has to take up whatever the family business happens to be. And so it's a very familiar story that you'll see played out in sort of many examples in Indian public life. But for you, you get the strong impression this is quite a personal story, as you said, you knew lots of people like this in Delhi. So in a sense, talk about how you created Sunny and where the influences came from and how you decided to write him as this figure who at once is very powerful, but also sort of confused and lost amidst the sort of tumult of this world of Delhi that you're describing. You might imagine that he would be a kind of master of the universe character, but actually the more you read of him in the novel, you realize that he too is struggling to cope in this India that has been sort of turned upside down somehow.
I mean, that's an incredible description of Sunny. Thank you. I grew up with Sunny's. I was sent to a boarding school, and my family didn't come from money, but I grew up with these young boys whose families, again, when India sort of changed from a socialist model to a capitalist one, their families amassed a great deal of wealth, and you suddenly had these young men who became incredibly wealthy, and in the Indian tradition, it's a patriarchy as well. Like the sons always inherit the family business. Sometimes the family business is politics. Sometimes the family business is, a real business could be. And sometimes it could be even religion. Like I have a friend whose family, they were godmen, and now he's a godman, That's
just explain what a godman is.
Sorry, how do I? A godman is someone who's a religious spiritual leader, and but they're by their followers, which often number into the millions in India, they are almost considered living gods. They have various, they preach various ideologies. It's a Hindu tradition, so but but in the way that everything in India kind of has this taint of corruption running through it. So most of the godmen in India are extremely corrupt, and most of the godmen in India are incredibly wealthy, and a lot of them are now politicians. So it all kind of mixes together. So when I started to do the research, I remember I say, okay, I know these people, but now where is this wealth coming from? What are the sources of this wealth? That's when you start to understand sort of the way the Indian society has functioned. I mean, I worked as a journalist, but I didn't connect the dots until much later. And then you see that intersection of politics, of big business, of crime. The way people often ask me, especially in Europe, like, what is Indian mafia? And I say, like, Indian mafia is very different from the way you perceive mafia in the West. It's almost indistinguishable from the big politicians and businessmen. They're not on the other side of the law. Often they are the law. So especially in UP, which is Uttar Pradesh, the state where a large part of the novel is set in. So I think I've kind of deviated from your original question.
Oh, well, that's fine. I think people are interested.
Yeah.
But I suppose, did you view the book has a kind of moral sensibility, but Sonny is quite a sort of morally ambiguous figure, as in he's sometimes written sympathetically. On the other hand, he kind of wields power in a way that is very destructive, as you said. So in a sense, what were you trying to make the reader think about Sonny as a kind of an archetype, if you see what I mean? Were you trying to be critical or sympathetic to these types of kind of next generation tycoons that you happened to know when you were growing up?
I think I started off wanting to be incredibly critical, and I almost from a place of disgust and horror. But then, as you start writing it, first of all, you're not identifying with your character, but you do have to inhabit your character to write it. And I remember writing the Sonny pages were the hardest, because it's like you're trying to write an extremely a person who's, as you said yourself, like, they're meant to be brutal, and in Sonny's case, he's always trying to live up to his father, whose father is extremely ruthless, but he's not. So what does he do? How does he navigate this place? So I ended up feeling a great deal of sympathy for this character as the novel kind of went along.
I thought you might, in a way. And in a funny way, the book that I wrote is about tycoons, non-fiction book, and I ended up being completely fascinated by tycoons as a kind of category, because they faced pressures in their lives which were quite different from anything that anyone in this room would have experienced. As in, what's it like to have a father who isn't just your dad, but who happens to be a god man or a sort of significant figure? What's it like to have all of the pressures and expectations that come from being in one of these extraordinary rich families? And yes, so I sort of would end up thinking, gosh, many people would think that these lives are very easy and privileged, but actually they come with all manner of anxieties. And in actual fact, I don't think it gives too much away. At some point in the latter stages of the book, then he actually sort of has a panic attack towards, and so you're dealing with someone who's really struggling with his own place in an India that is changing very quickly. So
yeah, and struggling to be the son of this this parent who wants him to be very ruthless, but also not being a ruthless person himself. How do you and also laundering the sort of family the criminality? There's his family, they are sort of criminal businessmen, but he's also laundering the reputation. So he has to be this debonair, consummate man about town.
I actually can't remember from the novel. Did he often? What happened in India was that this was also, since this is a Western audience, this is the sort of corrupting influence of the West in a funny way, that the second generation of these Indian families, the children would be sent away to Western universities, and therefore they would come back and kind of struggle to balance, their fathers were these authentically Indian figures who often didn't speak very good English but knew how to work the Indian system perfectly, and they had been sent off to Wharton or Oxford or wherever it came, and came back with all these Western ideas and then had to sort of balance. Did you send him off to a foreign university? I can't quite remember what.
No, he doesn't. But another character, Dinesh, goes off, and Dinesh is the son of a kind of gangster, a politician, a muscle man, a wrestler. I think I'm not sure his father, but he's the chief minister of Uttar Pradesh, his father, and he sends his son off to study, who comes back with ideas of, democracy and social justice and rights and human rights, and that's
terrible ideas.
Yeah.
You're into all sorts of trouble.
Especially if you want to be a successful politician.
Let's just round out the trio of characters. So the third character, Neda, is the woman, a journalist, comes from a very different social background, as in sort of idea-rich, cash-poor, as it were, sort of high-status cash-poor. But so why did you sort of include her as the third character? And I mean, I presume she isn't terribly autobiographical, but given she's a female Indian journalist, then there must be a little bit of your own background in there somewhere. So in a sense, tell us about Neda.
So Neda is the daughter of these kind of very bohemian parents who live in an incredibly it's I guess what would you call Malcha Marg in Delhi is it's where the rich and the powerful live, but it's also where old money comes from, So it has that kind of, that's the address, and she's not. I mean, my family is very different. I came from I had a very kind of like conservative middle class upbringing, but I gave her my journalism background. I also gave her the fact that I wasn't a very good journalist. She's not a very good journalist. So, but Neda's family was the old, and that's why I wanted to have that. They represent the old power, which is waning actually when the novel is set, which is in the early years of the millennium, the kind of like intellectual elite, what people sometimes scornfully call like the Lutyens elite in Delhi or in India, which is, they came up with ideas of socialism and social justice, but they were also incredibly elite and privileged, and they sort of benefited from a lot of the aspects of the British colonialism. So they have very good education, and they have an incredibly privileged, good background, and she represents that old crumbling elite, and Sunny and his family represents the new power, that wealth, and is basically racing into India at that point. And so I wanted to show these two power centers and structures and what's going to happen. I mean, her family is crumbling, and his is coming up. So that was it. I mean, that was basically, but at the same time, at least at the time when the novel is set, Sunny wants to impress her. It's his, he's actually more insecure about his wealth. She's quite comfortable about it. So, or even the lack of her wealth.
So there we are. We have the three characters. Ajay works for Sunny. Sunny and Neda have a kind of off and on again relationship, and we're off to the races in this what the Guardian has called the sort of the Indian version of The Godfather. Now, so you say you set it in 2004, so right. 20 years ago. And I thought that was interesting, as in the book that I wrote, which was about the rise of India's billionaire class, was set later than that, but in a sense was telling a story that really began in the period from about 2004 to the financial crisis. There was this 5-year period where really, as you said, the effects of the political reforms and the opening up that happened in the early 90s kind of ran headlong into the moment in which globalization, economic globalization, was going at its very fastest. This was before the financial crisis. The world economy was cooking along very nicely. There was lots of money flowing into India, huge excitement about Indian growth. And then the wheels began to come off later. But in a sense, why 2004? In a sense, what was it about that period that made you think I should set this now as opposed to, I don't know, 10 years ago when Narendra Modi had just come to power, or 5 years ago? I mean, India has only got richer, but what was it that was particularly interesting about that time in the just after the turn of the millennium?
Well, that's the time I knew Delhi really well. So as a novelist, you always go to what you know. I wanted to start at that time because it was also, as I said before, a time of great change. So, and of course, Age of Vice is now a trilogy. So I'm writing the second, and that starts post financial crash. But as James will tell you, the financial crash did not impact India in the same way as it did in Europe and America and the West. We still had a few years of sort of great growth, and there was no real feeling of the crash, not till much later. So I set it in 2004, and then the second one is about going to be 2012-13, and that's the time when it was almost like this, just pre-Modi's election, where you had this sense of great decadence and corruption, and it felt like something was going to happen, and great middle class disillusionment and anger at the political classes, and which all of it sort of led to these civil society movements, and on the back of which came Modi. And then we have the rest of like the last 10 years, which, in my head are the Modi years. So I wanted to start with that because that was also a period I knew really well. And I could set my characters in the Delhi that I knew so well because I spent basically 8 hours just driving the streets and just talking to everyone.
So, yeah, I was going to ask, tell us a little bit about how you researched the book. It's a big book. You take us, Delhi is a sort of the main location, I suppose, but you take us on a tour of different parts of India, Uttar Pradesh, we'll talk about in a minute, the Himalayas, Goa. But so some of this was based on kind of your own experiences, but did you also go and interview a lot of tycoons and go and talk to people? Like, how did you research the book?
Well, I partied with the tycoon's sons for many years, and number two, no, I have like these cop contacts, these police people that I know very well now. A lot of reading, academic papers, a lot of research into, say, human rights manuals, prison manuals. And then just, there's also, because my mother lives in Greater Noida, which is also set in the book. And just people around me, like this, I had this scrapbook that I collected news stories from sort of the local pages of the Times of India, where like this little scam happened here, this murder happened here, this dacoity happened there, and I kept collecting them over a period of maybe 2 or 3 years, and I kept pasting them in the scrapbook. So it was just like I started to collect a dossier of crime, and
Must have got full pretty quickly.
Yeah, I did. And I just allowed these news stories to percolate, in my head. I don't even need to look at them again, but it was just the act of cutting them out from the newspaper and pasting them, which was almost like the sense of something's going to filter in me, and then the characters seem to just come sometimes organically from there. So that was one, and then of course, I didn't do the tycoons, but I did the sons of the tycoons.
Yeah, well, yes, I suppose sort of tycoons or junior tycoons.
Will probably be tycoons in the next 10 years or so. Yeah.
And so when we hadn't met before doing this, but we were messaging before we arrived in Zurich, and Deepti was torturing me by not telling me precisely on who some of the characters were based. But as you read the book, if you know India well, then some of the stories they're certainly familiar, as in not just the car crash, which is an archetype both in India and China, that there are sort of examples of rich people who've crashed cars in these circumstances. But there were plenty of other scenes where you think, oh gosh, I remember sort of reading about something that was a bit like that. So without wanting you to name names, I mean, were the circumstances in the book a real sort of potpourri of inspiration drawn from all sorts of places, or were there kind of particular real life characters or situations that were more inspirational than others, if you see what I mean?
Well, a lot of course, the book is dramatized. The characters might be based on people I know, but the events are just, dramatized and made kind of more exciting. So, I'll have to think and go through and say, okay, this is kind of has its basis in real life and this doesn't. So, no, it's weirdly, I don't even remember anymore. Because sometimes you've written, I was thinking about this the other day, that I'm not even sure now if the scenes that I've written happened or I made them up. so because in my head they're so real. So now it's like that it's starting to sort of blend, fiction, non-fiction, what actually happened, what didn't happen. It's all real in my head.
Tell us a little bit about the kind of portrayal of politics in the book. So actually, maybe before we get that, let's talk a little bit about Uttar Pradesh, because that is... So when I was in India, I lived in Mumbai, and I actually didn't spend very much time in North India. When I wrote the book, I decided that I had to go and spend more time in North India, and particularly the state of Uttar Pradesh is the sort of political center of gravity of India. It's the largest state, the most populous state. And I felt like I couldn't really write about India unless I had sort of refamiliarized myself with UP. And so took a journey from one side of the state to the other and ended up in a city called Gorakhpur, which features in the book. But for people who've never been to Uttar Pradesh and may never go, can you say a little bit about why this is almost the kind of the heart of the modern India, and maybe we talk a little bit about the politics there.
I would ask you to give your incredibly succinct journalistic take on UP, because I'm from Uttar Pradesh. I was born there. My grandma, both sides of my mother and father are both from there. My grandma was a gynecologist who's was a bit of a gangster herself. She ran a hospital, but in just an hour away from the Taj Mahal in this little town called Firozabad. But the hospital was on prime commercial land, which was coveted by the gangsters who came from there, and they tried to take it from her. They threatened her at gunpoint. She just wouldn't leave. She wouldn't budge. Her son, my uncle, would keep telling her, just leave, just come to Delhi, come to like civilization. She'd be like, no, this is my life. But the same gangster ended up becoming the chief minister of the state, a few years later. And that's how that kind of like that interplay between crime and politics, you see it because you hear these stories when you're growing up. I used to go there for my summer holidays every year. And then suddenly, this is in the 80s, and then the late 90s, the gangsters are the guys who are ruling the state. So I've just given my personal story and experience, and this is why I want to write about this, because I know it so intimately. But what were your impressions, and how would you characterize UP?
Yeah, so it's sort of complicated. So the state runs from Delhi in the middle of India, and then you can go, hundreds of miles to the east, and so it's a sort of state of huge contrast, as in, on the borders of Delhi, you have this kind of extraordinary redevelopment, new cities, big highways, and then you go all the way over to Varanasi. But it was actually Gorakhpur, which, there's nowhere in India left anymore which is poor in the way that you might have associated with, sort of sub-Saharan Africa. But that is a part of India that is, where social services are very basic. The roads are bad. There's a real kind of sense of deprivation in a way that some other parts of India you don't have. And then you have the kind of crazy politics. So I mean, my book was about crony capitalism, and the definition of crony capitalism is about collusion between the business and political elite. And so in a sense, the type of politics that you were writing about wasn't really national politics, the kind of politics that we might read about in the newspapers. Narendra Modi makes a speech, India is unveiling some reforms. This is the politics that happens one level down, which often was even more kind of squalid, if you see what I mean, as in you would have these mid-level regional tycoons who controlled the liquor business, like the Wadiyas, or they were often construction magnates. They had access to land. And one of the things that happened in India was that people discovered in the era of growth that old-style corruption wasn't really worth doing anymore, because that was small potatoes, as in if you could collude between business leaders and politicians, suddenly you had things that were enormously valuable. Patches of land that were previously worthless were worth millions of dollars. Telecom licenses and mining licenses were worth billions of dollars. And if you could extract these from the government, you could make a fortune that was astronomically larger than had ever been possible in India before. And that was the phenomenon of the early 2000s, as in it had never been possible to make this kind of money in India before, and suddenly it was. And so I suppose, you were also writing about this, actually as the novel goes on, the relationship between Sunny Wadia, the son of the tycoon, and Dinesh, the son of the chief minister, becomes one of the kind of central plot points. But sort of say a little bit about that. I mean, did you also know when you were growing up the sons of the politicians, or did you just know the sons of the business leaders?
No, I did know the sons of the politicians, and no, weirdly, of course, the politicians, the business leaders some of the business leaders became politicians, or in India, it's like in a kind of middle class family, you're told that one child has to enter the police service, to protect you in case something, and one has to and become a bureaucrat, and one has to become a doctor, right? That was what we were told as like good professional middle class parents. And I think in the politician business class, it was like one son will become a politician, one will take over the business, the interests, the tycoon, and one will, I don't know what the other one will do. Will probably live off the wealth. So a lot of these. The way the political and business structure, at least in UP, developed was that the criminals were indistinguishable from the businessmen, the big tycoons. And
often the criminals became politicians because the best way to protect yourself if you were a warlord was to become the local politician, because then no one was going to come after you.
Yeah, and that's what happened. So in the 70s and 80s, the politicians started hiring these musclemen and goons to help them capture, to win elections for them. So they'd go and do this thing called booth capturing, and through sort of like intimidation and force and coercion, they'd make people vote for the person they were working for. But very soon these criminals realize that they don't need to be working for someone else. They can become politicians themselves, to enrich themselves, to protect their business interests or their criminal interests. So I think there was a study in 2019 where you had 40% of the sitting politicians in parliament had serious criminal charges against them, ranging from murder to rape to kidnapping, dacoity, etc. And this phenomenon was particularly acute in Uttar Pradesh, right?
Yeah, this is the book that Nico mentioned, written by this a friend of ours called Milan Vaishnav, called When Crime Pays, is about this phenomenon in which it's not just that criminals became politicians, it was actually that being a criminal was often helpful in getting elected, as in it certainly wasn't unhelpful. It signaled to people that you were are kind of resourceful and resilient, and this was a very North Indian phenomenon.
Yeah, and also, there was this idea that if the people get to know that, this person's a criminal, they won't vote for you. No, they were actually voting for the criminals, because there's this word in Hindi, this dabang, which is kind of fearless, authoritative. There was an idea that at least this guy on top, this criminal, will be able to get things done. So the criminals were also getting elected on the basis that there were these strong men. They were the muscle. And because social services, at least in UP, were so woeful, it was so hard to do anything, to maybe find a job, to get your kids into a school. Maybe the sitting strongman politician would be able to do it for you. So the same guy will rob you, but then he'll also help you to kind of like just get basic services provided. And then you supercharge the economy in the late 90s. So then all these sitting criminals and politicians who are maybe wealthy, but then they become then they become millionaires and multimillionaires. So that's what happened. That's how Milan's book, it was a great eye-opener, and I remember it's so heavily underlined, It's like, okay, I get it.
I'm going to open up for audience questions in a minute. I have so many more questions, but I'll limit myself. I mean, I suppose I just wanted to ask a couple of things about the book and what became of it after it came out. I mean, when my book came out, I was sort of pleasantly surprised by how well it was received in India, despite the fact that, in a sense, it had lots of things it told a story about things that were wrong with the country. It was reviewed in the New York Times, and the New York Times review said, Mr. Crabtree claims this is an optimistic book about India, but if you read it, you'll find there's not very much to be optimistic about. And I suppose, in a sense, you might read this in India and think, this is a pretty negative portrayal of the history of the country. But how did it go down? I mean, amongst your sort of circle in Delhi, and more generally amongst the kind of the Indian reading public?
Well, first of all, your book is, it's excellent, which is why it was probably well received as well in India. Well, I was very happy with the Indian reception, because, they got it. It's basically, Age of Vice is about corruption. It's about power and complicity. It's couched within this scaffolding of a crime thriller, but really these are the themes. For Indians, a lot of Indians told me, like, this is stuff we see all around us all the time. It's nothing new, but just to have it laid out in this way is wonderful, is great. Harder, the response in the West has been more interesting, because a lot of people just kind of picked it up to read Ajay's story, which is, the young driver that we meet at the start, at the car crash. And of course, for them, it's almost like the hero's journey, and that's what they want. And I'm not going to give away what happens, but, there's almost a sense of, when it's the hero's journey, then you want the hero to do, to come out on top. And I was very much not interested in showing an unrealistic portrayal of what happens in India. For me, it's always, this is also about structural inequality and about structural violence and the destruction of hope and just kind of ambition and resilience in India, because it's really hard for a character like Ajay to be able to survive and to be able to thrive because of that structural inequality and violence that it's almost impossible, it seems sometimes, to get rid of. Like, how do we move? I don't know. I mean, and maybe that's what. Why did you think that your book is optimistic? I'm surprised.
That was a sort of slightly different question, as in, I suppose the argument that I was making was that India was going, you mentioned Gatsby, right? The subtitle of my book is India's New Gilded Age. And so I was comparing, in a limited sense, what's happening in India today to what happened in the United States after the Civil War, the era of kind of, tycoons and robber baron capitalism. And I suppose the argument that I was making was that every country goes through this period. It was true of Britain in the Dickensian era. or the United States after the Civil War, or South Korea in the 1970s, or China in the 2000s. And so, although India, at the time when I arrived, so you're going to write your trilogy, the second book sounds like it's set just before Modi arrived, and that was when I moved to India. And that was a time of great sort of self-laceration amongst the Indian upper middle classes, as in people were so disgusted with the kind of the looting and thievery that had gone on amongst the political and business elite in the period from 2004 to about that decade before Modi's election, that people had this, there was a sort of feeling as if India was somehow uniquely awful, uniquely corrupt and venal in its political system. And I suppose the reason why my book was optimistic was in a sense of saying, well, that's exactly what Mark Twain wrote about in the 1870s in the United States. And it's exactly what Dickens wrote about in the United Kingdom in the 1820s. And so many countries go through this period, and then they leave it behind. And so it's not something that's sort of uniquely awful about India. It's a stage of capitalism that tends to come with the creation of these robber baron tycoons and rising inequality. And then the question is, well, how do you deal with that? And that's the job that still has to be done. So that was why. So.
Okay.